It was the ivory bishop that first spoke, though not in words. The thermometer rising against its own nature had driven all of London into a peculiar daze that November, the kind of warmth that belonged to September, arriving like a guest 3 weeks late and staying far too long. By 12:30 on a Thursday, the streets of Marylebone were drowsy with it, the fog that usually clung to the chimney pots having retreated entirely, leaving the sky an untroubled grey. Inside 221B Baker Street, in that narrow front room where the sill caught the best of the pale northern light, the brass thermometer had climbed to nearly 58 degrees, a temperature that Mrs. Hudson had remarked upon twice already, shaking her head as though the weather itself had committed a minor betrayal. The bishop sat alone on the window-sill at first, where it remained for some hours before its absence was truly noticed. It was not a fresh piece. Anyone with even modest knowledge of ivory work would have seen that at once. The gleaming white had mellowed to the colour of old cream, or perhaps candle wax that had endured decades of drawing-room air. The carving was fine, precise, the work of a hand that had possessed both patience and skill. The mitre atop the bishop's head showed the creases of authentic ecclesiastical geometry, and the base bore, faintly, the mark of a craftsman's hammer. One small dent, long old, speaking of an accident during the final stages of carving, accepted and worked into the piece rather than abandoned. 3 observable facts, then: its age, its quality, and the deliberation of its placement. On the sill, centred, alone, not knocked over, not hidden, presented. The 4th fact, the contradiction, was that it had absolutely no business being there. When Mrs. Hudson discovered it, she did what any sensible woman would do. She picked it up. The piece was warm in her palm from the sun. What little sun had managed to penetrate the dimness of London on that strange hot day, and she turned it once, twice, observing its weight, its wholeness, the fine network of fissures in the ivory that suggested an age of considerable duration. Her first thought was for dust. Had it come through an open window? But no, the sill had been cleaned that morning, and the piece bore no smudge of street grit. Thieves, perhaps. But nothing was missing from the flat that she could discern, and a thief who broke in only to leave behind an object of apparent value was a thief of remarkable impracticality. By the time Mr. Holmes emerged from his laboratory at 12:30, drawn upstairs by an absence of distraction, for the morning had yielded no cases of sufficient interest to hold his attention, Mrs. Hudson had returned the bishop to its exact spot and stood regarding it with the particular expression of a housekeeper who had encountered something that fell outside her jurisdiction. "There is an ivory chess piece on your window-sill," she announced, deploying the tone of a woman who had concluded, after considerable thought, that directness is preferable to circumlocution. "I did not place it there. I have no knowledge of how it arrived, and the windows, I assure you, were not open last night." Holmes, descending the final step into the sitting-room with the loose, distracted posture of a man whose mind had recently been occupied by the crystalline structures of some obscure Prussic compound, paused. His dark eyes, which had been fixed on a point somewhere beyond the physical architecture of the room, refocused with the precision of a camera lens, and then he moved, with neither hurry nor delay, toward the window. What followed was not a flourish, but something quieter and, in its own way, more absolute, an observation so complete that it required almost no time at all. He stood before the sill, his fingers clasped lightly behind him, his breathing slow and even, regarding the bishop from a distance of perhaps 18 inches. He did not touch it. He did not yet move closer. "Ivory," he said, and there was something in his tone, not quite amusement but a close neighbour to it, that suggested the observation was not for Mrs. Hudson's benefit. 19th century work, but the ivory itself is considerably older, African or Indian, from the appearance of the grain. East India Company, perhaps, during one of the later periods when acquisition became less careful and export more careless. He leaned, fractionally nearer, his eyes narrowing. "The carving is English. The hand is competent, even elegant, but it is not expert. A gentleman's work, I should say. Someone with leisure enough to pursue such a craft and capital enough to work in materials of value. And it has been sitting here," He moved his head slightly, catching the light differently, studying the faint dust pattern around the base of the piece. For some hours, certainly, perhaps since early this morning, when the city's soot was still settling differently in this unseasonable warmth. The city's soot stirring differently in warm air, catching light oddly. Yes, that was it. That was precisely what Mrs. Hudson had felt without quite being able to name. Someone, Holmes continued, straightening, his shoulders drawing back into the habitual posture of a man returning from deep thought, has left me a chess piece. That much is evident. What is not yet evident, and here I confess myself genuinely intrigued, for it has been an arid morning, is whether this represents a threat, a taunt, or an invitation. Mrs. Hudson's face had taken on the expression of a woman listening to a foreign language spoken with perfect fluency. "A chess piece on your window," she said slowly, "is a threat, or an invitation." "If you leave gifts on a man's sill, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied, moving toward the mantelpiece with the restless energy of a man whose curiosity had begun to sharpen into something approaching hunger, "you are either declaring war, or you're asking to play." He was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting across the familiar topography of the sitting room, the stacks of paper, the violin resting against the piano, the unlit pipe resting in its stand. The shadows in the corners of the room were shallower than they ought to have been, flattened by the strange light of the warm day. And in that diminished darkness, something about the space felt subtly altered, as though the ordinary geography of the room had shifted by some fraction, too small for the conscious mind to register, yet large enough to trouble the eye. "I believe," he said, with a quality of voice that suggested he was speaking not so much to Mrs. Hudson as to the room itself, or to the day outside, or to some invisible correspondent who had taken it upon himself to announce his presence through the medium of a small carved bishop. "I believe someone has taken considerable trouble to deliver this without being observed, and I believe they intend to do so again." "Again?" Mrs. Hudson's voice rose with a note of concern. "The choice of peace is deliberate," Holmes said. And now he did turn back to her, and in his dark eyes there was a brightness that had not been present before. The brightness of recognition, though of what he did not yet say. A bishop is a piece of some significance in chess. It occupies the middle ranks. It moves diagonally through the board, seeing further than the pawns can reach, but constrained always by the boundaries of its own colour. It is, in short, the piece of a man with power and insight, but also with limitation and a certain distance. It is the piece a player chooses when he wishes to say something without speaking aloud. He turned back to the window, his hand rising as though to touch the bishop, then falling away without contact. "Mrs. Hudson," he said, "I wonder if you might bring tea. I find that I am not, after all, in want of distraction today. Quite the reverse." The thermometer climbed through the afternoon. By 3 o'clock the warmth had become almost oppressive, a weight pressing down on the city, holding it still and heavy, like a hand pressed gently but firmly against the back of one's neck. The windows, when Mrs. Hudson ventured to open them, admitted only hot air, and the breeze that occasionally stirred through the flat brought with it the scent of horse and coal dust, rendered somehow heavier and more present by the unnatural temperature. The bishop sat on the sill, unchanged, exactly placed. Holmes did not remove it. He did not, throughout the afternoon, touch it at all, though he referred to it frequently, sometimes aloud, to himself, as though carrying on a conversation with an invisible interlocutor, sometimes with only his eyes, his gaze drifting toward the piece at intervals that seemed almost casual, but which Mrs. Hudson, observing him, recognized as anything but accidental. "A puzzle," she heard him murmur at one point as she brought the second pot of tea. A declaration, a reference to some previous understanding. He was pacing by then, his hands occupied with the lighting of a cigarette, not his pipe, but one of the small, efficient cigars he employed when his mind was working at particular intensity, and the smoke curled upward in the still air of the room, creating spiralling patterns that dissipated slowly in the heat. "A man who plays chess," he continued, though whether to her or to himself remained genuinely ambiguous, knows that a game does not announce itself. It is played, if it is played at all, in the spaces between silence and speech. A gift on a sill is not the opening move of a game. It is an announcement of intent to play at all. He stopped pacing. He turned toward the window, his eyes fixed on the bishop with an intensity that seemed almost personal, as though he were regarding not an object, but a correspondent. "And a man who announces his intent to play chess with Sherlock Holmes," he said softly, "is either very confident in his own abilities, or very desperate to communicate something he cannot say aloud. I have not, I think, encountered the third option in some time. It would be refreshing." By evening the warmth had begun to break. The unseasonable heat that had persisted through the entire day seemed to give way, quite suddenly, at around 5:30, to something more seasonable. A shift in the air pressure, a gathering of cloud toward the north, a suggestion of rain sometime before morning. Mrs. Hudson, descending from the upper floors, remarked upon the change with the satisfied tone of a woman whose predictions at last had borne themselves out. "The summer pretended to return," she said, "and now it's tired of the charade." Holmes, who had barely moved from his position near the window throughout the day, not watching it precisely, but aware of it with a kind of subsidiary attention, the way one remains aware of one's own heartbeat, without directing conscious effort toward listening, merely nodded. "Tomorrow," he said, "the first piece will be joined by another. I am certain of it." "And what will you do?" Mrs. Hudson asked. Holmes smiled, not widely, but with a quality of warmth that suggested genuine pleasure at the prospect of what was to come. "What any player does when presented with an opening move," he said. "I shall wait for the second move to determine my response." He turned from the window at last, and in the gathering dusk the bishop remained alone on the sill, an object of such apparent insignificance that the eye might pass over it entirely, and yet in its isolation, its precise placement, its silence, there was something that spoke clearly to anyone who knew how to listen. A conversation, it seemed, had begun. And conversations, once begun in earnest, rarely concluded without revealing something of those who conducted them. The morning after the bishop arrived carried with it a quality of dread that no morning truly ought to possess. Holmes had been correct, as he had been correct about so many small unremarkable things, regarding the second piece. It appeared not on the window-sill but on the doorstep of 221B Baker Street itself, discovered by the postman at 7:30, when the London streets were still reluctant in their awakening, and the previous night's promised rain had gentled into a persistent mist that clung to the pavements and rendered the world soft-edged and uncertain. The postman, a fellow named Carstairs who had held his position on this particular route for nearly 30 years, possessed the particular quality of mind that comes from walking the same streets through all weathers and seasons, a practical acceptance of oddity, coupled with a certainty that if something did not immediately threaten property or person, it was probably someone else's concern entirely. He had therefore deposited the piece, a white knight this time, carved with even greater delicacy than the bishop, its mane rendered in such fine detail that one could nearly count the individual hairs, on the hall table alongside the ordinary correspondence, and departed without comment. Mrs. Hudson discovered it at 8 o'clock when she came down to begin the day's work. By the time Holmes had descended, freshly dressed and possessed of the peculiar energy that came to him when a puzzle had begun to emerge from its fog of insignificance, the knight had been moved to the sitting-room and placed, with careful deliberation, beside the bishop on the mantelpiece. The two pieces faced one another across a span of perhaps 8 inches, not quite close enough to touch, but near enough that their positioning suggested communication, or perhaps confrontation. "Two pieces," Holmes said, and his voice held that particular quality of satisfaction that suggested he had spent at least some portion of the night not in sleep but in thought. "From 2 different hands, or the same hand employing different means of delivery. The first, through the window, a message of apparent innocence, something that might have been left by anyone, noticed by anyone. The second, through the door, a declaration of access, of knowledge, of routine, of capability." He stood before the mantelpiece, his hands clasped behind him, his eyes moving between the two pieces with the methodical attention of a man reading text written in a language he had not encountered before, but for which he possessed a key. "The bishop," he continued, "is a piece of distance and diagonal sight. The knight, by contrast, is a piece of unexpected movement. It leaps, it surprises, it arrives where it was not anticipated. And yet both are pieces of middling rank in the hierarchy of chess. Neither is the king, demanding surrender. Neither is the queen, demanding dominion. These are pieces of complexity, of layered purpose. Watson, who had entered the room at that moment bearing the Morning Post, and a certain weariness that suggested he had not slept as thoroughly as circumstances might have recommended, came to a halt in the doorway. "Good Lord, Holmes," he said, "another piece? In 2 days?" "In 2 days," Holmes agreed, "we have been presented with 2 pieces of a chess set. Of specific pieces, and if the pattern holds, and patterns do hold, Watson, when they are deliberate, we shall receive another tomorrow, or tonight, or at some hour calculated to achieve a particular effect." He turned from the mantelpiece, his dark eyes focusing on Watson, with an intensity that suggested he was, in fact, pleased by his friend's arrival. "Tell me, my dear fellow, when one receives pieces of a chess set delivered to one's door, without explanation or context, what does one naturally conclude?" Watson set the Post aside on the side table and moved toward the fire, where Mrs. Hudson had kindly ensured there was sufficient warmth to combat the morning's damp chill. "That someone is mad," he suggested, with the tone of a man who has learned, through long association, that his suggestions would be received with a kind of affectionate dismissal. "That someone is attempting to communicate," Holmes corrected, though not unkindly. "There is a distinction. Madness is often random. This is anything but. The selection of pieces is deliberate. The bishop first, the knight second. The methods of delivery are deliberate. Through the window, then through the door. The timing is deliberate. 1 piece per day, at different hours, as though to establish a pattern that cannot be ignored, and yet which cannot quite be predicted." He retrieved the knight from the mantelpiece and held it up to the light. What little light the mist-bound morning admitted through the windows. The piece was warm ivory, yellowed slightly with age, and the carving was indeed magnificent. The horse's head possessed both nobility and a kind of eager vitality, as though at any moment it might leap from its base and gallop away into some adventure. "The same hand," he said softly. "Both pieces. The craftsmanship is distinct, but the philosophy is identical. A gentleman's work, someone with skill, with patience, with access to materials of value. Someone, moreover, who understands chess well enough to select pieces with deliberate meaning." The morning progressed in a state of peculiar suspension. Holmes did not venture out, which was in itself notable, for a man of his temperament rarely remained indoors when the possibility of investigation presented itself. Instead, he remained in the sitting-room, moving between the 2 chess pieces with a restlessness that suggested his mind was operating at several layers of intensity simultaneously. He made notes on scraps of paper, which he then discarded. He played the violin, a scale repeated over and over, until Watson found himself unable to concentrate on the morning's newspaper. He stood at the window, watching the street below, as though the next delivery might arrive in the middle of the day, defying expectation. It was Mrs. Hudson who, at 11:30, remarked upon something that Holmes had, in his intensity, overlooked. "The room," she said, appearing in the doorway with the particular expression of a woman who had satisfied herself that she possessed information of value, "has changed." Holmes turned from the window, his eyes focusing on her with an immediacy that suggested his mind had been partially occupied with precisely this observation, waiting only for confirmation from an external source. "Explain," he said simply. Mrs. Hudson entered the room fully, and in her bearing there was the confidence of a woman who had kept house for long enough to know the dimensions of every room in the building as intimately as she knew the lines of her own hand. "The sitting-room," she said, "is larger than it was yesterday." For a moment so brief that it might have been entirely imaginary, though Watson, observing Holmes in that instant, suspected it was not. There was a quality of surprise in Holmes's expression. Not surprise at the information itself, but surprise at its source. Surprise that the observation had come from Mrs. Hudson, whose mind he had perhaps relegated in some corner of his consciousness to the mundane details of cooking and cleaning, rather than to the subtle mysteries of spatial geometry. "Explain if you would," he repeated, and there was in his tone now a quality of genuine deference. "The windows," Mrs. Hudson said, moving toward the far wall and placing her hand against the frame. "The distance from this corner to the window. I was thinking about the curtains, you understand, whether they might be replaced this autumn, and I measured it against yesterday's position, using the floorboards as my guide. The room has grown by what I should estimate to be approximately 18 inches in width." Watson had risen by this point, and was now looking between Holmes and the housekeeper with an expression of frank bewilderment. "That is impossible, surely," he said. "Rooms do not simply expand." But Holmes was moving now, moving with a purpose and a certainty that suggested that a significant portion of the fog obscuring the case had, in that moment, begun to lift. He passed his hand along the wall where Mrs. Hudson had indicated, running his fingers across the wainscoting, feeling for evidence of disturbance, of recent work, of the minutest suggestion that something about the physical boundaries of the room had been altered. "It is not impossible at all," he said, his voice taking on that quality of focused intensity that Watson had learned to associate with the moment at which Holmes began to see clearly. "It is merely improbable, which is an entirely different matter. What is probability, after all, but a measure of how often we have encountered something previously? I have encountered rooms that have been carefully reconstructed, walls that have been moved, spaces that have been subtly altered, and I have encountered them, perhaps, more often than the general population might expect." He turned to face them both, Watson and Mrs. Hudson, and in his eyes there was a brightness that suggested the transformation of confusion into clarity was already well underway. "Someone," he said, "has not merely been leaving chess pieces on our doorstep. Someone has been entering this building. Someone has been working, with considerable care and considerable skill, to alter the very dimensions of the space in which we stand. The question is not whether this is possible, Watson. The question is whether we have been observant enough, in recent weeks, to notice the work being done." Mrs. Hudson's hand had gone to her throat, a gesture that suggested she was experiencing something between indignation and concern. "You mean to say that someone has been in this house? Without my knowledge?" "Without anyone's knowledge," Holmes corrected gently, "which suggests either extraordinary skill or extraordinary access, or both." He moved toward the wall on the far side of the sitting room, the wall that abutted the neighbouring building, and began a systematic examination of the wainscoting, running his fingers along each joint, feeling for evidence of recent work, of disturbance, of the subtle signs that would indicate alteration. "The expansion," he said, more to himself than to them, "is on this side only. One wall, the wall that faces the street to the west, which means that the space between this building and the structure beside it has been redistributed. What was space belonging to the neighbouring property has become, through means I cannot yet determine, space belonging to 221B. "But that is theft," Watson said, with the tone of a man stating the obvious. "That is something considerably more complex than theft," Holmes replied, and he had crouched now at the base of the wall, his eyes focused on a particular point where the wainscoting met the floorboards. "Theft is the taking of something. This is the alteration of something. This is not a man stealing space. This is a man rebuilding space, recalibrating the geometry of London itself, in order to accomplish some purpose that we have not yet begun to understand." He rose, and in his eyes there was something that Watson recognized as hunger, intellectual hunger, the hunger of a mind that had been presented with a puzzle of sufficient complexity and originality to occupy it fully. "Mrs. Hudson," he said, turning to her with a quality of courtesy that suggested genuine apology, "I wonder if you might make a small journey for me, to the title office or the land registry? I find I should very much like to know the precise dimensions of the property adjoining ours, specifically the property to the west, and whether anyone has in recent weeks purchased it, leased it, or taken possession of it in any manner whatsoever." "I shall go at once," Mrs. Hudson said, and in her bearing there was a quality of determination that suggested that if anyone had been foolish enough to tamper with her domain without proper authority, they would have to answer for it directly to her. She departed, and in her absence Watson found himself standing alongside Holmes in the altered sitting room, regarding the 2 chess pieces on the mantelpiece as though they had, in the last few minutes, transformed into something far more significant than mere carvings in ivory. "What does it mean?" he asked, though he suspected that the answer would be complex and possibly still incomplete. "It means," Holmes said softly, "that someone has been attempting to expand my sitting room, which means that someone has been attempting to alter the very space in which I exist, which means, my dear Watson, that we are not dealing with a simple message or a simple threat. We are dealing with something far more deliberate, far more intricate, and far more fascinating than either of us has yet begun to comprehend. He moved toward the window, and in the mist-bound street below, a figure, no, merely a shadow, merely the suggestion of a figure, Rayson, seemed to pass, and whether it was connected to their mystery or merely the ordinary traffic of the city conducting its ordinary business, there was no way of knowing. The morning shifted toward noon. The mist gathered and then began gradually to lift, and in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, 2 chess pieces remained on the mantelpiece, keeping their silent vigil, waiting for the third piece to arrive, for it would come, Holmes was certain of it, and with it perhaps the beginning of understanding. Mrs. Hudson returned at 2:30, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and troubled confusion that suggested she had obtained precisely the information Holmes had requested, though its implications had proven somewhat more complex than anticipated. She entered the sitting room with the bearing of a woman who had successfully navigated the bureaucratic labyrinth of London's administrative offices and emerged with knowledge intact, if not exactly undamaged by the experience. Behind her came Watson, who had ventured out some minutes earlier with the intention of fetching the afternoon post and had encountered Mrs. Hudson on the steps of the registry office, returning with a stack of papers that she now deposited, with considerable deliberation, on the table beside the hearth. "Number 223, she announced, settling herself into the chair that Holmes indicated with a gesture. "The building to the west. It has been owned for the past 4 years by a Mr. Edmund Harrow, a gentleman of private means retired from some profession in the Navy, though the details are not entirely clear from the records. The property is registered as a single-family residence, though there have been no tax assessments filed for the past 18 months which the clerk found to be unusual." Holmes had risen at the first mention of the name, and now stood motionless, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the visible walls of the room, as though he were consulting some vast catalogue of information stored entirely within the architecture of his own mind. "Harrow," he said, and there was something in his tone, a quality of distant recognition perhaps, or the echo of a memory only partially retrieved, that suggested the name was not entirely unfamiliar to him. Edmund Harrow, naval officer. Yes, that accords with certain information I have encountered, though not recently, not, I should say, in any context that would have suggested his current residence in Marylebone. Watson had moved toward the mantelpiece and was now examining the 2 chess pieces with renewed attention, as though their presence had taken on new significance in light of this revelation. "A naval officer," he repeated. "Surely that would suggest someone of honour, of military bearing, of many things," Holmes interrupted, not unkindly, "but primarily of discipline. A naval man understands structure, understands the arrangement of space, understands the importance of precise measurement and careful planning. If one were to select a profession from which to draw someone capable of undertaking the subtle alteration of a building's geometry without detection, one might do considerably worse than the Royal Navy." He had begun to pace now, his hands clasped behind his back, his body moving with a restlessness that suggested his mind was operating at several layers of intensity simultaneously. "But why," he continued, speaking as though the question had escaped his lips without conscious intention, "would a retired naval officer, living in seclusion in the building adjoining mine, undertake the considerable labour of expanding my sitting room? What possible purpose could such an act serve?" It was at that precise moment, the moment at which Holmes had articulated the question most clearly, and the air in the room seemed to pause, as though waiting for the universe to provide an answer, that the third piece arrived. Unlike the bishop and the knight, which had announced themselves through conventional means of entry, the third piece materialized in the most extraordinary manner imaginable. There was a sound, a soft scraping, as though wood were being moved across wood with deliberate care, and then, from the wall that Mrs. Hudson had identified as the site of the recent expansion, a section of the wainscoting simply shifted. It was not a dramatic revelation, nor was it accompanied by any sound of mechanical violence. Rather, it appeared that a carefully concealed panel, constructed with such precision that its seams were nearly invisible to the casual eye, swung gently inward, revealing a narrow aperture, and in that aperture, placed with careful deliberation on a small shelf carved from the interior space, sat the third piece, a rook, white ivory, carved with the simplicity of a fortress tower, austere and elegant in its minimalism. For a moment of pure suspended astonishment, none of them moved, It was Mrs. Hudson who recovered first, her hand rising to her throat, her eyes widening with an expression that mingled outrage and indignation in equal measure. "In my house," she said, her voice acquiring a quality of controlled fury. "Someone has been in my house, in this very room, during the hours when we were occupied elsewhere, and has cut into my walls." Holmes, however, had moved forward immediately, drawn toward the aperture as though by the pull of a powerful magnet. He did not initially touch the rook. Instead, he examined the opening itself, running his fingers along the edges of the panel, studying the mechanism by which it had been constructed, observing with a quality of absolute concentration the precise angles and measurements that had gone into its creation. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "Absolutely extraordinary. The panel is constructed from the original wainscoting. Note the grain of the wood, Watson, how it matches precisely with the surrounding wall. Whoever executed this work possessed not merely skill, but a kind of artisanal precision that borders on the obsessive." He reached into the aperture and withdrew the rook with extraordinary care, as though the piece were not carved, ivory but some fragile object that might shatter under the slightest pressure. "A rook," he said softly. "The third piece. A castle, a fortress, a piece of power and linear movement, constrained to straight lines, but possessing the ability to traverse the entire length of a board in a single move." Watson had come to stand beside him, and together they examined the piece, which was indeed of magnificent construction. Simple, yes, but simple in the manner of things designed by minds that understand that true beauty lies not in ornamentation but in the perfection of form. "But what does it mean?" Watson asked, and there was in his voice a quality of frustration that suggested he was beginning to feel the weight of a mystery that seemed only to deepen with each new revelation. "Why chess pieces? Why your sitting room? Why would a retired naval officer—" "Ah," Holmes said, and he turned to face Watson with an expression that suggested a sudden illumination. "But we do not yet know that it is indeed Harrow undertaking this work. We know only that he owns the adjacent property, and that, for some time past, it has been underutilized." He moved toward the window, the rook held loosely in his hand, and gazed out at the street below where the afternoon mist had, in the past few hours, begun to lift entirely. The unseasonable warmth had persisted throughout the day. The thermometer, which Mrs. Hudson checked with religious regularity, had climbed to nearly 60 degrees, and the city seemed subdued by it, drowsy, as though the heat were pressing down on the streets and buildings with the weight of a deliberate choice. "Chess," he said, speaking as though engaged in a private dialogue with himself, "is a game of strategy, of position, of the relationship between pieces and the space they occupy. To send pieces, one at a time through different means, each suggesting something about the sender, is to speak in a language that few would understand, and fewer still would recognize as intentional communication." He turned back to them, and in his eyes there was a brightness that Watson recognized as the precursor to revelation. "The bishop was the first piece," Holmes said, "a piece of distance and diagonal sight. It was left on the windowsill, the most visible location, the place most likely to be noticed. It spoke of an announcement, a declaration of presence. The knight was the second piece," he continued, "a piece of unexpected movement, of surprise. It was left on the doorstep, suggesting access, capability, knowledge of routine. It spoke of an assertion of power. The rook is the third piece," he concluded, "a piece of linear power and fortification, and it arrived not through any conventional means of entry, but through a secret passage carved deliberately into the fabric of this very room. It speaks, my dear Watson, of something considerably more intimate than either of the previous pieces. It speaks of invitation." Mrs. Hudson had settled herself back in her chair, though her posture suggested a state of alert vigilance rather than relaxation. "An invitation to what?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of scepticism. "To play," Holmes said simply. "To engage in a game whose rules we have not yet begun to understand, but whose opening moves are becoming increasingly clear. Someone, whether Harrow or someone acting on Harrow's behalf, has been attempting to communicate with me through the medium of chess pieces. The selection of pieces, the methods of delivery, the alteration of this very room, all of it constitutes a language. And if we are clever enough, we may yet decipher what that language is attempting to say." Watson had moved toward the concealed panel, examining it with the careful attention of a man accustomed to investigating unusual physical phenomena. "The mechanism," he said, running his finger along the edge of the opening, "is quite ingenious. The panel must be opened from within the neighbouring space. There is no visible catch on this side. How would one even know it was there?" "That," Holmes replied, "is precisely the question we must ask. How would anyone know? And more importantly, for whom was it constructed? The presence of the rook suggests that the panel was not created for the purpose of delivering it, but rather that the panel existed first, waiting for its moment of revelation." He held the rook up to the window light, studying it from every angle, observing the precision of its carving, the quality of the ivory, the subtle signs of age that marked it as possessing considerable antiquity. "This piece is older than the bishop or the knight," he observed, "considerably older. The ivory has the patina of something that has been handled frequently, kept with care, treasured. And yet it was selected to be the third piece in this sequence, which suggests that we are not dealing with a random collection of chess pieces, but with a set of specific significance chosen for specific reasons." The afternoon was beginning to shift toward evening, the strange warmth persisting despite the sun's declining position in the sky. Mrs. Hudson rose and moved toward the windows, where she began the process of drawing the curtains against the fading light, a gesture so ordinary, so mundane, that it seemed to anchor the room to normalcy, even as events had begun to spiral toward something considerably more mysterious. "The gentleman next door," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Has he been seen? Has anyone observed him entering or leaving the property?" "An excellent question," Holmes replied, and there was in his tone a quality of genuine admiration. "Mrs. Hudson, your instincts have proven considerably more acute than I had given them credit for being. The question of Mr. Harrow's visibility, or rather his lack thereof, becomes increasingly significant the more we consider it." He moved toward the small desk that occupied the corner of the sitting room, and began, with swift precision, to compose a brief note. His handwriting, as always, was precise and economical, each letter formed with the certainty of someone who used language as a tool, and saw no reason to embellish its function with unnecessary flourishes. "Watson," he said, not looking up from his writing, "I should like you to take this note to the registry office. It requests information regarding the recent comings and goings, or rather, the lack thereof, associated with number 223 Marylebone. The clerks there will have records of tax assessments, utility payments, deliveries and the like. If Mr. Harrow has been in genuine residence, there will be evidence of it. If he has not—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. "And what will you do?" Watson asked. "I shall examine the mechanism by which this panel operates," Holmes replied. "There is a story written here, Watson, in the architecture of wood and iron and careful human effort, and if I am patient enough and observant enough, that story will reveal itself." By the time Watson departed with the note, the evening had truly begun to settle over Marylebone. The unseasonable warmth persisted, creating an almost dreamlike quality to the air, as though the city had slipped sideways into some other season, some other time, where the normal rules of autumn no longer applied. Inside 221B, Holmes remained at the concealed panel, his fingers tracing its edges, his eyes studying its construction, his mind clearly occupied with the problem of understanding how and when and why it had come into being. Mrs. Hudson brought him tea, which he allowed to grow cold without tasting it. She brought him dinner, which he equally ignored. And when Watson finally returned, an hour past midnight, bearing the results of his investigation, he found Holmes still there, still studying the panel, though by that point the meaning of the panel seemed to have subtly shifted in his understanding from a physical puzzle to be solved into a communication device, whose message was only now beginning to be properly read. "Well?" Holmes asked, not looking up from his examination of the wood grain. "What did the clerks reveal?" Watson settled himself in the chair by the fire, his fatigue evident in every line of his posture. "No records of residence," he said. "No utility payments in the past 18 months. No deliveries, no tax assessments, no evidence whatsoever that number 223 has been occupied. According to the registry, the property has been dormant." "Dormant," Holmes repeated, and there was in his voice something that might have been satisfaction. "Not abandoned, you note, not in disrepair. Dormant, as though it were merely sleeping, waiting for the moment at which it would be required again. He turned from the panel at last and moved toward the mantelpiece, where the 3 chess pieces now sat in a careful arrangement. The bishop, the knight, the rook. 3 pieces, 3 moves, a game beginning its opening sequence, its first moves played against an opponent who had not yet, technically, made a move at all. "Tomorrow," Holmes said softly, "we shall receive another piece. I am certain of it. And with each piece, the pattern will become clearer. Not the identity of our correspondent, though that too will eventually reveal itself, but the message he is attempting to convey. A game, Watson. A deliberate, careful game. And we are only now discovering the rules by which it is to be played." Outside, the November night pressed against the windows, the unseasonable warmth persisting like a secret being held by the city itself, waiting for the moment at which it would finally have to be spoken aloud. And in that strange, warm darkness, somewhere between the known and the unknown, between the visible and the hidden, a game continued to unfold, its pieces moving with a deliberation and purpose that spoke of planning, of patience, and of a mind that understood, with absolute certainty, the rules of engagement. The 4th piece arrived on Saturday morning, and with it came a letter. The letter was the unprecedented element. The first communication beyond the silent vocabulary of chess pieces and architectural alterations. It was delivered by the ordinary post, addressed in a careful, educated hand to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and bore a postmark from Hampstead dated the previous day. Mrs. Hudson, discovering it among the morning's correspondence, placed it on the breakfast table with a kind of ceremonial significance that suggested she understood, without needing to be told, that this particular communication represented a turning point in the mystery. The 4th piece, a white pawn, carved with the simplicity of a soldier standing at attention, had been left, of all places, in the entry hall, balanced with extraordinary precision on the narrow marble shelf above the coat rack. It was a location that would have been visible to anyone entering or leaving the building, and yet it had been placed with such delicate care that it had not fallen, despite the passage of multiple people through that space since it had been left there. Holmes held the letter unopened for a long moment, turning it over in his hands, studying the weight of the paper, the quality of the ink, the precision of the script. Watson, occupying his usual position by the morning fire, watched this ritual with the patience of a man who had learned that Holmes's methods of investigation often proceeded through phases of apparent inactivity before suddenly crystallizing into action. "The postmark," Holmes observed, "is from Hampstead. The hand is educated, a gentleman's hand certainly, but not the hand of someone accustomed to the formality of business correspondence. There is a hesitation in certain letters, a quality of deliberation that suggests the writer chose each word with considerable care." He broke the seal and unfolded the letter with the same deliberation with which he had examined it. The epistle was brief, a single page written in the same careful hand. "My dear Mr. Holmes, you will forgive, I trust, the unconventional manner of our introduction. I have taken it upon myself to establish a dialogue through means that I believed would interest a mind of your particular calibre, and I trust my assumption has not proven entirely mistaken. The pieces, as you have no doubt deduced, compose the opening moves of a game. Not a game of mere strategy, but a game of understanding, of recognition, of the possibility that there exists in this world at least one other mind capable of comprehending what I have attempted to communicate through their silent presence. I am aware that you will by now have discovered the alterations to your sitting room, the concealed panel, the careful expansion of the space in which you occupy your thoughts. These alterations were undertaken not out of malice, but out of necessity. The necessity of creating a physical space capable of housing a truth that cannot be spoken aloud, and therefore must be demonstrated through action. If you are willing, and I believe you are, for few minds would resist the invitation that I have extended, I should like to invite you to 223 Marylebone. At your earliest convenience, come alone. Come without prejudice or preconception. And come with the understanding that you're being invited not to solve a crime, but to play a game that has, in truth, been in progress for far longer than you might suspect. With utmost respect and genuine admiration, E. Harrow. For a long moment after completing the letter, Holmes remained silent, his eyes fixed on the paper, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested his mind was operating at several layers of intensity simultaneously. "It is an invitation," Watson said, breaking the silence. "A formal invitation to visit this man at his home." "It is considerably more than that," Holmes replied, and his voice held a quality of excitement that Watson recognized as the precursor to a profound shift in understanding. "It is a confession. The man admits to the alterations, to the chess pieces, to the entire elaborate construction of this mystery. But more importantly, he offers a characterization of the game itself. Not a crime to be solved, but an understanding to be achieved." He rose and moved toward the window, where the unseasonable warmth had persisted through the night and into the morning. The thermometer, which Mrs. Hudson had positioned on the external sill, registered nearly 62 degrees, a temperature that was becoming almost oppressive in its unnaturalness, as though the season itself had been suspended between autumn and something else entirely, something waiting to be named. The expansion of the sitting room, Holmes continued, turning back to face Watson, was not destructive but constructive. It was not undertaken to damage or to violate, but to create space for something. The question becomes, create space for what? Watson had risen as well and now moved to examine the pawn, which Holmes had placed on the mantelpiece alongside the bishop, knight, and rook. 4 pieces now, the beginning of an army, but arranged in a pattern that suggested something quite different from conventional chess strategy. "These pieces," Watson observed, running his finger carefully along the carved surface of the pawn, "are not arranged as they would be at the opening of a game. They are arranged deliberately, as though they tell a story when read in sequence." "Precisely," Holmes said, and there was in his voice a note of genuine satisfaction. The bishop, a piece of distance and observation. The knight, a piece of surprise and unexpected movement. The rook, a piece of power and linear force. The pawn, a piece of humble beginning, yet capable of transformation. They form a narrative, Watson, a story told through the language of chess. It was Mrs. Hudson who provided, unexpectedly, a crucial piece of information. She had appeared in the doorway of the sitting room with the bearing of a woman who had taken it upon herself to conduct some investigation into the matter, and she carried with her a small bundle of newspapers, which she deposited on the table, with a gesture that suggested she had accomplished something of significance. "I took the liberty," she said, settling herself in the chair that Holmes indicated, "of inquiring among the other household staff in the neighbourhood regarding the gentleman at 223 Marylebone. The building, you see, requires maintenance. Windows must be cleaned, chimneys must be swept, drains must be attended to, and such work inevitably brings workers into contact with the staff of the household in question." She opened the bundle of newspapers to a particular page, dated some 15 years previous, and pointed to a small article lodged among the crime reports and society notices. "Admiral Edmund Harrow," she read aloud, "has retired from active service after a distinguished career with the Royal Navy, during which he served with honour in 3 continents, and conducted himself with the dignity befitting an officer of his rank. The Admiral is known to have had certain differences of opinion with Mr. Sherlock Holmes some years ago regarding a matter of investigation, though the nature of this disagreement has not been made public. The Admiral has taken residence in Hampstead, where it is understood he intends to pursue his interests in maritime history and," she paused, looking up from the newspaper, "the game of chess." For the second time in their long association, Watson observed Holmes to be genuinely surprised. It was only a brief moment, a flicker of something unexpected crossing his features, before he recovered his customary composure, but it was unmistakable. "Admiral Edmund Harrow," he said slowly, moving toward the window and gazing out at the street below. "Yes. Now the matter begins to clarify itself. Not a case, Watson, but a reconciliation. Not a crime, but a game undertaken by a man who has spent 15 years, contemplating a chess match with a mind he believes capable of understanding what such a match might signify." Watson moved to stand beside him, and together they looked out at the Marylebone streets, where the unseasonable warmth had created an almost ethereal quality to the light, the city's soot stirring differently in the warm air, catching the light in an oddly beautiful manner. "What happened?" Watson asked. "Between you and Admiral Harrow?" Holmes was silent for a long moment before responding. When he did speak, his voice held a quality of regret that was rare in a man whose emotional landscape was typically characterized by intellectual detachment. "I was wrong," he said simply. "In an investigation some 15 years ago, I concluded that Admiral Harrow had been involved in a matter of espionage. I was thorough, I was methodical, and I was absolutely, completely wrong. By the time the error became evident, considerable damage had been done, to his reputation, to his career, to his dignity. The matter was resolved quietly, of course. The Admiral was exonerated. But some injuries, Watson, do not heal simply because the error that caused them is corrected." He turned from the window and moved back toward the mantelpiece, where the 4 chess pieces sat in their careful arrangement. And now he has spent 15 years, a period of time that speaks volumes about the depth of his feeling in this matter, undertaking an elaborate construction through which to invite me to understand that I was wrong. Not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through the medium of a game, through chess, through the language of strategy and understanding and mutual respect. The decision, when it came, was almost inevitable. Holmes dispatched Watson to make certain inquiries at the offices of the Admiralty regarding Harrow's current status and circumstances, while he himself prepared for what he termed an engagement of considerable personal significance. By mid-afternoon, as the unseasonable warmth began to create a peculiar haziness over the London streets, Holmes stood at the threshold of 221B Baker Street, dressed with the care of a man preparing for something more formal than an ordinary social call, and made his way toward Hampstead. The journey itself was undertaken with a quality of deliberation that suggested Holmes was not merely travelling through physical space, but moving through something more significant. A passage through time, perhaps, or through the geography of regret and misunderstanding that had accumulated over 15 years of separation and silence. Number 223 Marylebone appeared, from the exterior at least, to be an ordinary Georgian townhouse, well-maintained, respectable, the windows clean, and the brick facade unmarred by the soot that typically accumulated on London buildings, left to the ordinary processes of urban decay. But as Holmes approached the door, he observed details that suggested a mind of considerable cultivated interest. The brass fixtures bearing the patina of regular polishing, the windows hung with curtains of an excellent quality, the knocker fashioned in the shape of an anchor, a small touch of naval tradition. The door was opened not by a servant but by the Admiral himself. Edmund Harrow was a man of perhaps 60 years, tall and straight-backed despite his years, possessed of the bearing that comes from a lifetime in military service. His hair was white, his face weathered in the manner of someone who has spent considerable time exposed to the elements, and his eyes, grey, sharp, missing nothing, held an expression of such intensity that it was immediately clear why he had selected chess as his primary mode of communication. Words, for a man possessed of such a depth of feeling, would have been woefully inadequate. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and his voice was that of a man accustomed to command, yet speaking now with a quality of extraordinary gentleness. "I have waited a considerable time for this moment." "Admiral," Holmes replied, and there was in his tone a formality that spoke of mutual respect between equals. "I confess myself both intrigued and, I should add, appropriately humbled by your initiative." Harrow stepped aside, indicating the interior of the building, and Holmes entered into a space that seemed to have been constructed entirely around the pursuit of chess and the cultivation of maritime history. Books lined every wall, chess treatises dating back centuries, naval histories, accounts of exploration and discovery. And in the centre of what had once been the sitting room, an enormous chessboard had been constructed, the squares inlaid into the floor itself, creating a physical game that one could literally walk through and inhabit. "For 15 years, Harrow said, moving into the room and gesturing to the board, "I have been contemplating this. Not merely the chessboard itself, but the manner in which I might invite you to understand what I have come to understand in the years since our unfortunate disagreement. That understanding," he continued, his eyes meeting Holmes's directly, "is this. Chess is not a game of victory. It is a game of conversation, of two minds meeting on a field where the only possible outcome is mutual comprehension." Holmes stood on the edge of the physical chessboard, taking in the magnificence of its construction, the care that had gone into its creation, and the profound statement it represented. "The pieces," Holmes said softly. "The 4 pieces you sent me. They were not opening moves toward a standard game. They were something considerably more subtle. They were an apology," Harrow replied, "expressed through the medium that I believed would reach a mind like your own most effectively. The bishop, observation and distance. The knight, the recognition that truth often arrives by unexpected routes. The rook, the assertion of linear truth, unadorned and direct. The pawn, the humble acknowledgement of beginning again, of transformation, of the possibility that even the smallest piece may become something greater. He gestured toward a table at the far side of the room, where two chairs faced one another across a conventional chessboard, set up and ready for play. I have no wish to refight old battles, Mr. Holmes. I have no wish to establish who was right and who was wrong. That matter has been settled by history and by the passage of time. What I wish, if you are willing to grant it, is to play a game with you. Not a game to be won or lost, but a game to be played and understood. A game that speaks, silently, of two minds that have come to comprehend one another, not through words, but through strategy and patience and mutual respect. Holmes looked at the Admiral for a long moment, and Watson, had he been present to observe this scene, would have recognized in his expression something rare, a quality of genuine emotion, the kind that Holmes typically kept constrained behind the walls of his intellectual fortress. "I should be honoured," Holmes said simply, "to play that game." And so they sat, in that room filled with the accumulated evidence of a life spent in contemplation of war and strategy and the subtle arts of human understanding, and they played chess. Not as competitors, but as two minds engaging in a dialogue that required no words, that proceeded through the movement of pieces and the contemplation of position, and the slow unfolding of mutual comprehension. The afternoon wore on. The unseasonable warmth persisted outside, the shadows on the floor of the chess room growing shallower as the afternoon light shifted and changed, and inside two men, one who had been wronged, one who had committed the wrong, communicated through the only language that could adequately express what they needed to say to one another. The game that emerged from their play was extraordinary in its subtlety. Neither man attempted to achieve victory in the conventional sense. Rather, each move seemed designed to create beauty, to express understanding, to demonstrate that the board itself was not a battlefield but a space of profound collaboration. The game continued for hours, moving through phases of complexity and simplicity, building towards something that transcended the ordinary rules of chess and became, instead, a philosophical discourse rendered entirely through the medium of 32 carved pieces and 64 squares. By the time the game reached its conclusion, though conclusion is not quite the accurate word for what occurred, for the game simply ended when both players recognized that what needed to be said had been said. It was evening. The light had faded entirely, and the room had assumed the quality of something dreamlike, a space existing outside ordinary time. Holmes rose from the table and Harrow rose with him. No words passed between them. Words would have been unnecessary, would have constituted in a sense a violation of the pure communication that had transpired. Instead, the Admiral simply extended his hand, and Holmes took it, and in that gesture all of the regret, the misunderstanding, the 15 years of separation were acknowledged and, if not precisely forgiven, then at least understood and accepted as part of the complex history that bound two remarkable minds together. When Holmes returned to 221B Baker Street that evening, Mrs. Hudson and Watson were waiting, their expressions hovering between concern and curiosity. "Well?" Watson asked. "What transpired? What is the nature of this mystery?" Holmes settled himself in the chair by the fire, his expression thoughtful in that particular way that suggested his mind had been fundamentally altered by recent experience. "There is no mystery," he said simply. "There never was. There is only a game, Watson. A game played by two minds attempting to communicate across the span of years and misunderstanding. And I find, to my profound surprise, that I have missed the opportunity to engage in such a game considerably more than I would have anticipated." He looked toward the mantelpiece where the 4 chess pieces remained in their careful arrangement. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "there will be a 5th piece, and the day after a 6th. The game continues, Watson, and I find that I am remarkably content to allow it to do so." The 5th piece arrived 3 days later, and with it came an unexpected visitor. The piece itself, a white queen, carved with extraordinary delicacy, adorned with the suggestion of a crown that spoke of royalty without descending into ostentation, had been left not on the sill or the doorstep but directly on Holmes's desk in the sitting room, positioned precisely in the centre of a blank sheet of paper that bore a single line of text in Harrow's careful hand. The most powerful piece, and yet the one most often underestimated. Do you understand? Watson, discovering it during the morning hours when Holmes was occupied with correspondence, felt compelled to examine it with considerable interest. The piece was indeed masterful, perhaps the finest of the pieces yet received. The ivory had taken on a pale golden tone with age, and the craftsmanship suggested the work not of a gentleman dabbling in sculpture, but of an artisan of considerable professional standing. It was Mrs. Hudson, however, who noticed the arrival that mattered far more than the piece itself. She had been attending to the sitting-room windows, engaging in that particular ritual of morning cleaning that seemed to occupy a significant portion of her daily existence, when she observed, standing on the pavement below, a boy. He was perhaps 14 or 15 years of age, possessed of the kind of thin, awkward frame that suggests growth occurring faster than the body can quite manage, and he was engaged in the remarkable behaviour of standing perfectly still while gazing upward at the windows of 221B Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, observing him with the particular scrutiny that comes from years of maintaining a household and understanding the patterns of ordinary street traffic, noted several things. His clothing was of good quality but somewhat ill-maintained, suggesting a household lacking in feminine oversight. His posture suggested deep internal conflict between the desire to approach the building and a powerful reluctance to do so, and his eyes, when they occasionally flickered downward before returning to their fixed, upward gaze, held an expression of such yearning that it seemed to speak of something considerably more profound than ordinary childhood curiosity. She reported this observation to Holmes as soon as he emerged from his laboratory, and it produced an effect of such immediate and comprehensive interest that Watson, who happened to be present, recognized it at once as the beginning of a new layer of complexity unfolding within the mystery. "Describe him," Holmes said, abandoning entirely the chemical apparatus he had been occupied with, and moving toward the window with the swift precision of a man whose attention had been wholly captured. Mrs. Hudson provided a detailed account of the boy's appearance, his bearing, the quality of his attention as he stood in the street below. Holmes listened without interruption, his eyes occasionally flickering toward the street itself, as though he might observe the boy through the force of his concentration alone. "And how long did he stand there?" Holmes asked, when Mrs. Hudson had completed her description. "Nearly 20 minutes," she replied, "until he seemed to gather some resolution, and then he turned and walked away. Toward Hampstead, I should say, given the direction of his departure." Holmes had turned from the window, and on his face was an expression of such profound understanding that it seemed to Watson that some significant piece of the puzzle had just settled into place. "The Queen," Holmes said softly, moving toward his desk where the newly arrived piece rested on its sheet of paper. Not merely a piece, but a statement, the most powerful piece on the board, and yet, as Harrow has noted, the most often underestimated. A piece that represents not domination but support, not conquest, but the subtle exercise of influence and protection. He picked up the piece and held it to the light, and in his expression Watson recognized the particular intensity that came when Holmes had begun to perceive connections that others had missed. "The boy," Holmes continued, turning back to face them, "is significant. His presence here, his obvious reluctance to approach the building, his yearning quality, these things are not accidental. Harrow has sent him, or rather, Harrow has encouraged him to come, and the boy is struggling with the courage required to complete the journey." "But who is he?" Watson asked. "What is his connection to all of this?" Holmes did not immediately respond. Instead, he moved toward the mantelpiece, where the 5 chess pieces now resided in their careful arrangement: bishop, knight, rook, pawn, queen. He stood regarding them for a long moment, his mind clearly engaged in the process of ordering information, of drawing connections, of perceiving the larger pattern that the individual pieces suggested. "If I am correct," he said at last, "the boy is the reason for all of this. Not the victim of a crime, not the perpetrator of a mystery, but the reason. The central purpose around which Harrow has constructed this entire elaborate game of chess pieces and architectural alterations and carefully orchestrated invitations." The unseasonable warmth had persisted through the morning, and the thermometer had climbed to nearly 64 degrees, a temperature that was beginning to become almost oppressive in its unnaturalness. The soot of London stirred differently in the warm air, and the city seemed to have assumed the quality of something trapped between seasons, suspended in a moment of temporal uncertainty. Holmes made a decision with characteristic swiftness. He composed a brief note, which he entrusted to Watson with instructions that it be delivered, under cover of apparent casualness, to the location in Hampstead where Harrow was known to reside. The note contained only a few lines. The boy came. He gathered courage, but not quite sufficient to cross the threshold. Tomorrow I shall be ready to receive him. Bring him to me, if you will, at 3 o'clock. Watson, executing this errand, found Harrow in the room with the magnificent chessboard, engaged in what appeared to be a game of solitaire, a practice that struck Watson as oddly melancholic for a man who had, only 3 days previous, engaged in the most beautiful game of chess Watson could have imagined. Harrow read the note, and on his weathered face an expression passed that spoke volumes about the depth of emotion involved in whatever was to transpire. "He came then," Harrow said softly. "The boy gathered sufficient courage to approach, even if not sufficient to enter." "Mr. Holmes seems to have understood the situation," Watson offered carefully, "though he has not explained it to me." Harrow gestured to a chair, and Watson settled himself, recognizing that he was about to receive information of considerable significance. "The boy," Harrow said, moving toward the extraordinary chessboard inlaid into the floor, "is my grandson, Charles Edmund Harrow, though he goes by the name Charles, or sometimes simply by no name at all, for he has inherited from me a certain quality of reserve that his parents have come to view as a deficiency rather than a trait." He stood on one of the squares of the board, and the light from the windows fell across him in a particular way, rendering his outline slightly ethereal, as though he were not entirely present in the physical space. "His parents are dead," Harrow continued, "lost in a railway accident some 18 months ago. Charles was taken in by a distant cousin, a man of considerable means but limited imagination, who has come to view the boy as something of a burden, a responsibility discharged through provision of food and shelter, but not through any genuine affection or understanding." He turned to face Watson directly, and in his eyes there was a depth of sorrow and protective fury that rendered him suddenly very human, very vulnerable. "The boy plays chess," Harrow said. "He plays it with a quality of understanding that I have encountered only twice in my life, once in my own youth and once in a consultation room at Baker Street some 15 years ago. When I was forced to retire from service, when my reputation had been damaged by circumstances beyond my control, I came to Hampstead to live out my remaining years in solitude. And I discovered, almost by accident, that my grandson possessed a quality of mind that seemed to demand something more than the ordinary pursuits of ordinary boys." Watson listened with growing comprehension as Harrow explained the situation. The boy had been brought to Hampstead, had been taught chess by his grandfather, had begun to develop a capability that suggested he might, in time, become a player of considerable distinction. But the boy's distant cousin, Charles's guardian, viewed chess as an idle pursuit, an unnecessary frivolity, and had begun to discourage his participation in it. "I have spent 15 years contemplating reconciliation with Mr. Holmes," Harrow explained, "and in that contemplation I came to realize something important, that the boy might benefit considerably from exposure to a mind of Holmes's caliber, not merely as an intellectual exercise, but as a validation that his particular gifts, his capacity for strategy, for observation, for the subtle arts of logical thinking, represented something of genuine value in the world." "And the pieces?" Watson asked. "The alterations to his sitting room?" "A game," Harrow replied. "A game designed to accomplish two things simultaneously: to demonstrate to Mr. Holmes that I had spent years contemplating not revenge, but reconciliation, and to create the circumstance by which the boy might be brought into contact with a mind capable of understanding what he possessed and how it might be cultivated." The following afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, the boy arrived at 221B Baker Street. He was accompanied by Harrow, but remained clearly reluctant, his posture suggesting the complex emotional terrain of a youth caught between hope and fear, between the desire to connect and the powerful conditioning that had taught him to expect rejection. He was taller than Mrs. Hudson's earlier observation had suggested, and his eyes, grey like his grandfather's, held the same quality of intensity, though in him it manifested as uncertainty rather than confidence. Holmes received him in the sitting-room, in the space where the expansion had been made, in the room that had been subtly altered through careful effort to accommodate something that had not existed before. The boy looked around with an expression of wonder at the accumulation of detail, at the evidence of an extraordinary mind's engagement with the world. "Charles Harrow," Holmes said, and his voice held a quality of gentleness that Watson had rarely encountered in him. "Your grandfather has indicated that you play chess. I should very much like to know if you're willing to tell me why you play and what you hope to accomplish through the game." The boy's response was faltering at first, but as he began to speak, something seemed to shift within him. He explained that he played chess because it was the only language through which his grandfather seemed to genuinely understand him, that in the game the arbitrary rules of society did not apply, and a mind, regardless of age or social position, could meet another mind on equal terms. Holmes listened with complete attention, and when the boy had finished he rose and moved toward a chessboard that had been positioned near the window, where the afternoon light fell in a particular way that rendered the squares and pieces clearly visible. "Let us play," Holmes said simply, not to determine who is the superior player, but to establish whether two minds meeting on the board might accomplish something neither could accomplish alone. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable game of chess that had ever been played in that sitting room. The boy, having overcome his initial reluctance, revealed himself to be a player of genuine sophistication, not merely in his technical knowledge of openings and endgames, but in his understanding of the game as a dialogue between two intelligences. Holmes, meanwhile, played with a quality of patience and encouragement that surprised Watson greatly. Rather than attempting to demonstrate his own superiority, Holmes seemed instead to be engaged in drawing the boy's attention to aspects of the game that the boy had not yet considered, to be creating circumstances by which the boy's own understanding could expand and deepen. The thermometer outside had begun by this time to show signs of the weather finally breaking. The unseasonable warmth that had persisted for a week was beginning to give way to something more seasonable, clouds gathering toward the north, a suggestion of cooler air beginning to filter down from Scotland. But inside the sitting room, the atmosphere remained warm and laden with significance. Mrs. Hudson appeared at one point bearing tea and biscuits. Extra biscuits, as though she had understood without needing to be told that this was an occasion of some importance. Watson, having been positioned by Holmes to keep score, though the scoring of this particular game bore little resemblance to the scoring of any conventional chess match, found himself occupied in observing not merely the game itself, but the transformation occurring in the boy's bearing as the afternoon progressed. Harrow stood at the periphery of the room, observing his grandson with an expression of such profound paternal love that it seemed to Watson that the boy's very presence was sufficient to justify all of the careful construction, all of the chess pieces, all of the elaborate game that had been undertaken. The game itself proceeded through phases of remarkable beauty. Neither player seemed primarily concerned with achieving victory in the traditional sense. Instead, each move seemed designed to create a board state of greater complexity, greater beauty, greater philosophical significance. The boy, growing in confidence, began to make moves that suggested understanding not merely of tactical positioning, but of the deeper strategic intentions that Holmes was attempting to communicate. It was the boy, finally, who brought the game to its conclusion. He moved his queen, a piece that had remained largely defended throughout the game, into a position of apparent vulnerability. Holmes, recognizing the move for what it was, smiled and conceded the game. But in conceding it, he did so with a gesture of profound respect, as though acknowledging not a victory, but the expression of a perfectly calibrated idea through the medium of 32 carved pieces. "You understand," Holmes said to the boy, his voice holding a quality of genuine warmth, "what very few minds ever come to understand. That chess is not a game of domination, but a game of communication. That the point is not to defeat one's opponent, but to engage in a conversation of such depth and complexity that the ordinary boundaries between victory and defeat become meaningless." The boy's face had taken on an expression of such profound relief and validation that Watson found himself moved by it. Here was a young person, previously dismissed and discouraged, suddenly encountering an adult who recognized his particular gifts not as frivolity, but as evidence of a genuinely exceptional mind. "What will you do with this understanding?" Holmes continued. "How will you employ these gifts that your grandfather has recognized, and that I have now, I trust, confirmed?" The boy considered the question with a seriousness that spoke to the depth of his nature. When he answered, his voice was steady and clear. "I should like to study," he said. "Not the conventional education that my guardian has arranged for me, but something deeper, something that would allow me to understand the world through the lens of logic and observation and strategy. Holmes glanced at Harrow, and in that glance there was communicated an understanding that needed no words. The Admiral nodded fractionally, and Holmes turned back to the boy. "Then I believe I might be able to assist you," Holmes said. "Not in the formal sense of employment or apprenticeship. Such arrangements would likely provoke conflict with your guardian, and would therefore be counterproductive. But I have accumulated, over the years, a considerable library of works on logic, observation, the methodology of reasoning. If you were to visit on certain afternoons when your other obligations permit, we might engage in conversations designed to expand your understanding of these matters." The boy's response was to simply nod, as though words had suddenly become insufficient to contain the emotion of the moment. The afternoon shifted toward evening, and gradually the gathering dispersed. Harrow and his grandson departed together, but before they left, the Admiral approached Holmes and extended his hand. "The game is not yet finished," Harrow said quietly, "but I believe we have moved into a new phase, one in which the outcome, whatever it may be, will be of considerably less significance than the process by which we arrive at it." Holmes clasped his hand, and in that gesture there was sealed a reconciliation that had taken 15 years to accomplish, and that seemed likely to continue indefinitely, not as the resolution of a conflict, but as the establishment of an ongoing dialogue between two remarkable minds. When they had gone, Watson found himself alone with Holmes in the sitting room. The light was fading rapidly now, as though the day was hurrying toward its conclusion, eager to escape the lingering traces of the unseasonable warmth. The chessboard remained in its state of conclusion, the pieces frozen in the exact position at which the boy had achieved his victory. "A remarkable afternoon," Watson observed. "A necessary one," Holmes replied, settling himself in the chair by the fire. "You see, Watson, when one is wronged, or believes oneself to be wronged, there are several possible paths forward. One might pursue revenge, one might cultivate bitterness, one might retreat from the world and accept the damage as permanent and final." He picked up the queen from the chessboard and held it to the light, observing its carving with the appreciation of a man who understands the value of craftsmanship. "Or," he continued, "one might take that wound and transform it into something of value. One might use it as the impetus for growth, for change, for the creation of something that did not exist before." Harrow chose the last path. He took 15 years of regret and transformed it into an elaborate game designed not merely to reconcile with me, but to create the circumstance by which a brilliant young mind might be recognized and encouraged. He returned the queen to the board, positioning it in the center of the field. "The game is not finished," as he said, "but the most important moves have been made. What remains is simply the continuation, the ongoing dialogue between minds that recognize in one another something of value, something worth preserving and cultivating." Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway, bearing fresh tea and an expression of such satisfaction that it seemed to Watson she had understood, perhaps better than anyone else, the significance of what had transpired. "The boy will return?" she asked, with the tone of a woman stating something that was clearly obvious to her. "Regularly," Holmes confirmed. "I believe we shall establish a pattern, Saturday afternoons perhaps, when his guardian is occupied with his social obligations. We shall play chess, we shall discuss matters of logic and observation, and gradually, I trust, we shall build in him the confidence necessary to pursue his interests despite the discouragement of those who do not understand their value." The weeks that followed Charles's first visit to 221B Baker Street seemed to unfold in a manner that suggested the very geography of London had somehow been reordered around the simple fact of his arrival. The autumn, having been interrupted by that strange period of unseasonable warmth, now returned with a quality of deliberate vengeance, as though the season were reasserting its authority after having been so thoroughly displaced. The thermometer that Mrs. Hudson consulted with religious regularity had begun its descent from those precipitous heights, 64, 62, 58 degrees, and the soot of London had resumed its more conventional patterns of behaviour, no longer stirred by anomalous heat into configurations that caught the light in oddly beautiful ways. But the most significant change was not in the weather, and it was not in the physical alterations that had been made to the sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The most significant change was in the boy himself. Charles Harrow began to arrive on Saturday afternoons, with the regularity of a ritual, appearing at the door with his grandfather, who would remain only long enough to ensure that the boy was settled before departing to occupy himself with his own pursuits. The boy would sit across from Holmes at the chessboard, and the game would begin, not always a formal game, though sometimes it was, but often a dialogue conducted through the medium of pieces and positioning, a conversation in which Holmes served as both teacher and interlocutor. Watson, who had taken to positioning himself as an observer during these sessions, noted the transformation with the careful eye of a man accustomed to documenting the subtle shifts that occur in human nature when genuine understanding is extended to someone who has previously been denied it. The boy's posture gradually straightened. His eyes began to hold less of that uncertain yearning and more of a quiet confidence. His responses to Holmes's questions became less hesitant, more assured, as though he were gradually being granted permission, by Holmes, by his grandfather, and most importantly by himself, to claim ownership of his own intellectual gifts. It was during the third Saturday visit that Holmes introduced a new element to their sessions, a series of logic problems unrelated to chess, designed to develop the boy's capacity for observation and inference. These problems range from the ridiculously simple, identifying which of several objects had been moved from its original position, to the extraordinarily complex, involving chains of reasoning that required the ability to hold multiple variables in mind simultaneously while tracking their relationships to one another. Observation, Holmes explained as he placed a small collection of objects on the table before Charles, a teacup, a pen, a book, a letter opener, a handkerchief, is not the passive reception of information. It is an active process, a deliberate choosing of what to attend to and what to allow to recede into the background. Most people observe without seeing, hear without listening, look without comprehending. What we must cultivate in you is the capacity to reverse that process, to make observation itself the primary activity of your mind. He removed the objects and placed a cloth over the space where they had rested. "Tell me," he said to Charles, "what was not present among these objects?" Charles frowned in concentration, his eyes closed as he attempted to reconstruct the scene in his mind. When he answered, his voice was hesitant but ultimately correct. There was nothing that suggested violence or secrecy or deception. There was nothing personal in the sense of something that would reveal the character of the person who owns these objects. There was nothing that suggested urgency. Holmes smiled, and in that smile Watson recognized the particular satisfaction of a teacher, encountering a student whose mind possessed genuine capacity for growth. "Precisely," Holmes said. "You have not merely observed the objects that were present. You have begun to understand the significance of what was absent. That is the beginning of true observation, understanding not merely what is, but what is not." The afternoons extended as the weeks progressed. Mrs. Hudson, observing the pattern, began to ensure that extra biscuits and tea were always available during these Saturday sessions, not through any specific instruction from Holmes, but through the simple understanding that comes from years of managing a household and recognizing the signs of something of significance transpiring within its walls. The fire in the sitting room was kept at a particular temperature, warm enough to encourage relaxation but not so warm as to induce drowsiness. The windows were positioned to allow the afternoon light to fall in particular patterns across the chessboard, creating shadows that aided rather than hindered observation. It was Watson who first noticed the subtle change in Harrow's bearing when he arrived to collect his grandson at the conclusion of each Saturday session. The Admiral, previously carrying himself with the careful posture of a man bearing profound emotional weight, seemed to have lightened somehow, not in the sense of carelessness, but in the sense of a burden that had gradually been redistributed, made more manageable through the knowledge that his grandson was being recognized and encouraged. One Saturday, as Harrow arrived to retrieve Charles, he asked Holmes if he might speak with him privately. Watson and Charles were directed to engage in a game of chess, one of the formal variety in which Holmes had prescribed particular parameters to guide their play, while the two men withdrew to Holmes's study. It was a conversation that Watson never learned the full contents of, but when the men emerged some 20 minutes later, there was between them a quality of understanding that had not been present before. Harrow seemed to have achieved a kind of peace, as though whatever he had needed to communicate had been received and understood with the completeness he had required. The sixth Saturday brought with it a significant development. Charles arrived not merely with his grandfather, but with a letter addressed to Harrow, but clearly intended to be delivered to Holmes. It bore the seal of the guardian, Charles's distant cousin, and its contents created, for a brief moment, a quality of tension that had not previously existed in the comfortable routine. Holmes read it in silence, his expression remaining neutral, though Watson, observing him closely, detected the rapid movement of his eyes that indicated the processing of information of considerable significance. "What is it?" Watson asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "The Guardian," Holmes replied, folding the letter with deliberate care, "has received inquiries regarding Charles's whereabouts on Saturday afternoons. Someone, I suspect a servant, or perhaps a fellow at Charles's school, has observed his regular visits to this address, and has reported the matter to the Guardian as though it were a matter of concern." Charles's face had taken on an expression of such distress that both Holmes and Harrow immediately moved to address it. "This is precisely what I feared," Charles said, his voice trembling with a quality of emotion that suggested he was genuinely frightened of the consequences that might follow from his visits having been discovered. "My guardian has already indicated that chess is an idle pursuit, that my time would be better spent on more practical matters. If he discovers that I have been coming here, he will attempt to forbid it," Holmes interrupted, and there was in his tone a quality of certainty that suggested he understood the mind of the distant cousin with considerable precision. "But there is no legal mechanism by which he might do so. You are old enough that your personal associations, provided they do not place you in genuine danger, cannot be constrained without your consent." "But he might send me away," Charles said desperately. "There is a school in Brighton that he has mentioned. He said I might be sent there if my conduct did not improve. If he discovers this—" Harrow placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about the protective fury that had been building within him during the course of these sessions. "The school in Brighton is not a genuine concern," Harrow said, his voice holding a quality of absolute certainty. "I have taken the liberty of consulting with certain legal authorities regarding the matter of your guardianship. The distant cousin is your guardian only in name and through the convenience of circumstance. Should the matter be brought before a court, there are grounds upon which the guardianship might be transferred to someone more appropriate." Charles turned to his grandfather, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "You would do that?" he asked. "You would take me?" "I would," Harrow confirmed simply, "though I had hoped to allow events to unfold more gradually, to give your guardian the opportunity to come to his own understanding regarding the value of your pursuits. The revelation that your visits here have been observed may, in fact, be a blessing in disguise. It may force the matter to a resolution sooner than anticipated, which may ultimately serve your interests more effectively than a prolonged period of secrecy." The letter from the Guardian arrived 3 days later, delivered by post and bearing the tone of a man who felt himself justified in his concerns about the boy's well-being. It demanded an explanation of Charles's visits to 221B Baker Street, questioned Holmes's intentions in receiving a young gentleman of unstable character, and threatened various consequences should the visits continue. The tone was imperious, the accusations vague, the entire construction of the letter suggesting a mind that operated through assertion rather than through careful reasoning. Holmes's response was brief, courteous, and absolutely devastating in its logic. He explained that Charles had visited 221B Baker Street on multiple occasions with his grandfather's explicit permission, that the visits were conducted in an atmosphere of complete propriety, with witnesses present at all times, that the educational benefits of such visits far outweighed any theoretical concerns, and that, should the Guardian wish to continue the argument, Holmes would be delighted to engage in formal legal proceedings to establish the matter definitively. The Guardian, confronted with this response, seems to have recognised that he had encountered a mind possessed of considerably greater capability than his own. The visits were permitted to continue, though with a quality of grudging acceptance that suggested the matter had merely been postponed rather than resolved. It was Harrow who, several days after this exchange, made the announcement that had been implicit in all of his actions and statements since Charles had begun his Saturday visits. "I have been thinking," the Admiral said, as the three of them, Holmes, Charles and Harrow, sat in the sitting room on an afternoon when the autumn had fully reasserted itself, when the shadows on the floor were returning to their proper depth and the soot of London had resumed its conventional patterns, that the time has come for a more formal arrangement. The boy cannot remain indefinitely with his distant cousin, subject to threats and restrictions. He requires a stable environment, a household that understands and values his particular gifts. He turned to face Charles directly, and in his weathered features there was visible all of the emotion that 15 years of separation and recent weeks of reconciliation had accumulated. "I should like you to come and live with me," Harrow said simply, "permanently, not as an obligation or a duty, but as my grandson, as a member of my household, as someone whose presence would bring genuine joy to what has been, for some years, a rather solitary existence." Charles's response was to simply nod, unable to produce words, his eyes holding the kind of tears that come from the sudden release of years of accumulated uncertainty and loneliness. Holmes, observing this exchange, seemed to settle back into his chair with the expression of a man who has witnessed the successful conclusion of a carefully constructed plan. The chess pieces on the mantelpiece, bishop, knight, rook, pawn, queen, seemed to acquire new significance in light of this declaration. They were no longer merely pieces of an elaborate game between Holmes and Harrow. They were monuments to the process by which understanding had been achieved, by which reconciliation had occurred, by which the boy's future had been fundamentally altered through the simple act of recognition. "This requires a response from you," Holmes said to Charles. "Not now. There is no urgency. But within the coming weeks, the matter of your legal guardianship must be addressed. The distant cousin will not relinquish it willingly, but there are means by which such matters might be resolved through the courts, provided the appropriate arguments are presented." "Will you help?" Charles asked, and the question seemed to encompass far more than the legal matter itself. It seemed to be asking whether Holmes would continue to be present, would continue to acknowledge the value of what had been recognised in him. "I will," Holmes replied, "though I suspect you may find that your grandfather is considerably more capable in such matters than even I am. The Admiral has spent a lifetime navigating the complexities of institutional authority. The legal system will present little difficulty for a mind of his calibre." In the days that followed, a remarkable sequence of events unfolded. Harrow engaged solicitors, presented documentation regarding the conditions under which Charles had come into the guardianship of the distant cousin, and began the formal process of petitioning the court for a change in guardianship arrangements. The distant cousin, when confronted with the reality that his authority over the boy might be subjected to legal scrutiny, seemed to recognise that the matter had moved beyond his ability to manage through simple assertion. Within 3 weeks, the guardianship had been transferred. Charles, now living with his grandfather in the house at Hampstead that contained the magnificent chessboard inlaid into the floor, had been formally established as the Admiral's ward. His education continued, but now with the freedom to pursue his own interests and the active encouragement of someone who recognised those interests as evidence of genuine intellectual distinction, rather than as a frivolous waste of time. The Saturday visits to 221B Baker Street continued, though with a different quality now. No longer was Charles visiting in secret, in defiance of his guardian's wishes. Now he came openly, bringing with him the confidence of someone whose right to engage in these pursuits had been legally and socially established. The games grew more complex, the conversations deeper, the mutual understanding between the boy and Holmes extending into territories of logic and observation that had previously remained unexplored. Watson, observing these developments with the eye of a man who had learned to recognise the subtle shifting of human relationships, found himself profoundly moved by what he was witnessing. This was not a crime solved through logical deduction. This was something considerably more significant, a human connection established, deepened, and made permanent through the careful exercise of patience and understanding. It was on a Saturday in late November, nearly 2 months after Charles's first visit, that the final piece arrived. The 6th chess piece appeared on the mantelpiece without any of the fanfare that had accompanied its predecessors. It simply materialised one morning, placed among the other pieces by some means that no one in the household could quite identify, as though it had always been there and had merely been waiting for the moment of its recognition. It was a white king, carved with extraordinary delicacy, adorned with a crown that seemed to suggest not domination, but something considerably more subtle, perhaps guidance, perhaps understanding, perhaps the quiet exercise of authority that comes from the recognition that true power lies not in domination but in the creation of circumstances by which others might flourish. Holmes, discovering it among the mail one morning, held it up to the light and smiled in a way that suggested complete understanding of what it represented and what its arrival signified. "The game is concluded," he said to Watson, who had come down to the sitting room and found him examining the piece. "Or rather, the opening moves are concluded. The game itself, the true game, will continue indefinitely, played out not on a chessboard, but in the lives of the people who have been brought together through the medium of these pieces. He placed the king among its companions, bishop, knight, rook, pawn, queen, and stepped back to regard the complete set with an expression of profound satisfaction. "Do you understand?" Holmes asked, turning to face Watson. "What Harrow has accomplished through this elaborate construction of chess pieces and architectural alterations and carefully orchestrated invitations?" Watson considered the question carefully before responding. "He has accomplished a reconciliation between himself and you," he said slowly. "But more importantly, he has created the circumstance by which his grandson might be recognized and encouraged. He has built bridges, not merely between himself and you, but between his grandson and the world." "Precisely," Holmes said, and there was in his voice a quality of genuine warmth. "For what is a king, after all, but a piece that exists to protect and to enable the flourishing of all the other pieces on the board? Harrow has been a king in this regard, not ruling through domination, but through the subtle exercise of care and understanding." December arrived with the kind of certainty that only winter possesses, settling over London like a benediction, transforming the city into something softer, quieter, more forgiving than its ordinary self. The unseasonable warmth that had persisted for those strange weeks in autumn had become, in retrospect, a kind of interlude, a temporary displacement of the normal order of things that had served its purpose and then gracefully receded, allowing the world to return to its proper patterns. The chess pieces on the mantelpiece of 221B Baker Street had acquired, by this time, the quality of permanent fixtures. They were no longer new arrivals demanding attention and interpretation. They had become instead part of the ordinary furniture of the sitting room, objects that the eye might pass over without conscious attention, yet which remained present, speaking silently of the journey that had brought them there and the connections they represented. Watson, settling himself into his chair on a December evening, the fire crackling with the particular quality of warmth that belongs to winter, the windows dark with the early nightfall that had returned now that the days were shortening again, found himself contemplating the nature of mysteries and their resolutions. For it seemed to him that the mystery of the chess pieces and the alterations to the sitting room had been, in its essence, not really a mystery at all. It had been rather an invitation patiently extended, a communication carefully constructed, an offering of understanding made by a man who understood that words alone could never adequately convey what needed to be said. Holmes, entering the sitting room at that moment bearing his pipe and the evening newspaper, seemed to read Watson's thoughts with that particular perceptiveness that had been, for so many years, one of the defining characteristics of their companionship. "You are reflecting," Holmes observed, settling himself in the chair opposite Watson's, "upon the remarkable nature of the events that have unfolded over these past weeks. You are contemplating the extent to which a mind determined to communicate might undertake extraordinary measures to accomplish that communication, and the ultimate justification of those measures when they result in genuine human connection." "Precisely," Watson confirmed, with the mild surprise that he still experienced after all these years at Holmes's capacity to perceive his inner states through observation alone. "It strikes me as remarkable that Harrow undertook such an elaborate construction. The chess pieces, the architectural alterations, the careful orchestration of events, simply to accomplish what might, in theory, have been accomplished through a simple letter or a direct conversation." Holmes drew on his pipe, the smoke curling upward in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as though the smoke itself were engaged in its own form of communication. "But therein lies the distinction," Holmes replied. "A letter is merely words arranged on paper. A direct conversation is an exchange between two people conducted in the ordinary manner, subject to all of the limitations and defences that we erect when we anticipate criticism or confrontation. What Harrow undertook was something considerably more sophisticated. He constructed a language through which to speak to me in terms that my own nature could not help but comprehend. He understood that I am, by disposition and by training, a man who responds most profoundly to puzzle and strategy, and the careful exercise of logical thought. He therefore constructed his apology, his reconciliation, his invitation to understanding in terms that I could not ignore and that I could not misinterpret. He set his pipe aside on the small table beside his chair and leaned back, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the visible walls of the room. And in doing so, he continued, he accomplished something considerably more significant than merely reconciling with a man who had wronged him years previously. He created the circumstance by which a young person of genuine intellectual distinction might be recognized and encouraged. He established the foundation for a relationship that will, I suspect, continue to develop and deepen for many years to come. It was at that precise moment, as though responding to some invisible cue that only the universe itself could perceive, that Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway with the evening post. Among the ordinary correspondence and bills and circulars, there was a single letter bearing the seal of Harrow's household in Hampstead. Holmes opened it with the casual precision of a man accustomed to correspondence of all varieties, and his eyes moved across the contents with the rapidity that always suggested he was absorbing information at a rate considerably faster than most people could have managed. "Well?" Watson asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "What news from Hampstead?" "Good news," Holmes replied, and there was in his voice a quality of genuine warmth. "Charles has been enrolled at a private academy, not the brutal establishment that his distant cousin threatened him with, but rather a school that specializes in the cultivation of minds with particular gifts for mathematics and logic. The boy's progress in his studies has been remarkable. His instructors have already begun to discuss the possibility of university despite his youth." He set the letter aside and reached for his pipe once more, as though the communication had provided sufficient satisfaction to merit a return to his customary evening routine. "But more significantly," Holmes continued, "Harrow writes that the boy has begun to comprehend something that I have been attempting to convey to him through our Saturday sessions. That observation and logic and the capacity for strategic thought are not merely intellectual exercises. They are tools by which to navigate the world, to understand the motivations and capabilities of other people, to perceive truth beneath the ordinary deceptions by which we conduct our lives." Watson smiled, recognizing in this assessment the particular satisfaction that Holmes derived from the process of teaching a mind capable of genuine growth. "He will become a detective, then?" Watson asked. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, "or perhaps he will become something altogether different. The point is not what profession he ultimately selects, but rather that he will select it from a position of genuine freedom and genuine self-knowledge. He will not be constrained by the expectations of guardians who do not understand him, or by the fear of disappointing people whose approval he has learned not to trust. He will be free, Watson, in the truest sense of the word." The evening deepened. The fire in the sitting-room burned down gradually, requiring periodic replenishment. Mrs. Hudson brought tea, which remained largely untouched, a victim of both men's occupation with thought. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the hours as they passed, 8 o'clock, then 9, then 10, and gradually the ordinary traffic of London outside the windows diminished, yielding to the quiet that belongs to the late evening hours. It was Holmes who finally broke the contemplative silence that had settled over them. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the nature of games and the purpose they serve in human life. Chess, in particular, is often regarded as a game of domination, the objective being to capture the opponent's king and thereby achieve victory. But in my experience, the most valuable games of chess are not played for victory. They are played for communication, for the exercise of mutual understanding, for the pleasure of engaging with another mind in pursuit of something that transcends the ordinary categories of winning and losing." He rose and moved toward the mantelpiece, where the 6 chess pieces remained in their careful arrangement. His hand reached out, and with delicate precision he adjusted the position of the queen by the minutest fraction of an inch. "Harrow understood this," Holmes continued. "He understood that by constructing an elaborate game, one that involved not merely the exchange of pieces, but the alteration of physical space, the careful orchestration of events, the patient construction of circumstances, he could communicate something that words alone could never accomplish. He understood that the game itself was the message, and the message was understanding." Watson rose as well and moved to stand beside Holmes at the mantelpiece. Together they regarded the 6 pieces: bishop, knight, rook, pawn, queen, king, arranged in their particular configuration. "Do you think he will send more pieces?" Watson asked. Holmes considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he said finally. "The opening moves of the game have been completed. The pieces that were necessary to communicate Harrow's message have been delivered. What remains now is not the delivery of objects, but the continuation of the game itself. the ongoing dialogue that will proceed, through the Saturday visits, through the conversations between myself and the boy, through the gradual unfolding of understanding that occurs not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of shared experience. He returned to his chair and picked up his pipe once more, settling himself into a posture that suggested he had, for the evening at least, concluded the major business of thought and contemplation. "There is, however," Holmes said, his voice taking on a quality of reflectiveness, "one more element to this matter that I should address, particularly for your benefit, Watson. You have been present throughout the events that have unfolded over these past weeks. You have observed the mystery as it developed, the chess pieces as they arrived, the alterations to the sitting room, the arrival of the boy, the gradual transformation of his circumstances. I believe you should understand, fully and completely, the manner in which I came to comprehend what Harrow was attempting to accomplish." Watson settled himself back into his chair, recognizing that Holmes was about to engage in one of those post-adventure reflections that he had learned to treasure above almost every other form of communication. "On the morning after the bishop arrived," Holmes began, his eyes fixed on the fire, "I found myself standing at the window, regarding the piece on the sill, and I recognized something that I should have recognized years before, that the piece represented not merely an object, but a signature. It was the calling card of a mind that understood me, that understood my particular manner of engaging with the world, and that had chosen to address me in a language that I could not help but comprehend." He paused, drawing on his pipe, the smoke curling upward in patterns that seemed to illustrate the complexity of thought. "I remembered then the Admiral. I remembered the investigation that had gone wrong, the error that I had made, the consequences that had followed. But I also remembered something else. I remembered the quality of the man's mind. I remembered that he was possessed of a capacity for strategic thinking, for patience, for the careful construction of long-term plans. And I recognized that if anyone would undertake the kind of elaborate construction that the chess pieces and the architectural alterations represented, it would be a man of that particular character." "But why did you not simply confront him?" Watson asked. "Why not go directly to Hampstead and address the matter face to face?" "Because," Holmes replied, "to have done so would have been to reject the gift that he was offering. The gift was not the chess pieces themselves, nor was it the alteration of the sitting room. The gift was the opportunity to engage in a form of communication that transcended ordinary speech, that operated on the level of pure strategic thought. To have rejected that form of communication by simply knocking on his door would have been to reject the very heart of what he was attempting to offer." He rose once more and moved toward the window, where the December night pressed against the glass with the particular quality of darkness that belongs to winter evenings. "And I believe," Holmes continued, "that Harrow understood something else as well, that I was, in my own way, as isolated as his grandson was isolated, that I had built walls around myself that prevented genuine human connection, that I had retreated into the exercise of logic and observation as a means of avoiding the messier, more complicated realm of human emotion. In presenting his apology through the medium of chess, through this careful construction of a puzzle to be solved, Harrow was offering me not merely reconciliation, but a means by which I might open those walls, might allow genuine human connection to occur while maintaining the intellectual framework through which I operate." Watson listened to this extraordinary confession with the recognition that Holmes rarely, if ever, spoke so openly about his own emotional states and the mechanisms by which he attempted to manage them. The fact that he was doing so now suggested that the events of the past weeks had indeed accomplished what Harrow had intended, a genuine alteration of Holmes's understanding of himself and his capacity for connection with other human beings. The clock chimed 11, and the evening was drawing toward its conclusion. Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway to inquire whether anything further was required before she retired for the night. Both men assured her that nothing was needed, and she departed with the particular expression of satisfaction that suggested she had understood the significance of the conversation that had transpired between them. "I have been thinking," Watson said as the sitting room fell silent once more, "that this entire matter, the chess pieces, the architectural alterations, the arrival of the boy, the transformation of his circumstances, represents something remarkable about the human capacity for understanding and connection. Despite the years that separated them, despite the injury that had been done, despite all of the barriers that might have prevented reconciliation, Harrow managed to construct a pathway toward understanding, and in doing so, he accomplished something even more significant. He created the circumstance by which a young mind might be recognized and encouraged. Precisely, Holmes said, and there was in his voice a quality of such genuine satisfaction that Watson found himself moved by it. And that, my dear friend, is the true resolution of this mystery. Not the identification of a criminal or the solution of a puzzle through logical deduction, but the establishment of genuine human connection, the recognition of a mind capable of genuine growth, the creation of circumstances by which understanding might flourish. He set his pipe aside and rose to his feet, moving toward the window once more to regard the December night beyond. "The game continues," he said softly. "It will continue every Saturday when the boy arrives and we sit at the chessboard. It will continue through the years as he develops and matures and gradually comes to understand the full extent of the gifts that he possesses. It will continue, in fact, indefinitely, not as a competition to be won or lost, but as a dialogue between minds that have learned to recognize in one another something of genuine value." Watson rose as well, recognizing that the evening had drawn to its natural conclusion. Together, the two men stood at the window of the sitting room, looking out at the December night, the stars visible now that the unseasonable warmth had broken, the frost beginning to settle on the pavements below, the city settling into the quiet of winter. "Do you know what I think?" Watson said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I think that Harrow's greatest achievement was not the reconciliation with you, though that is significant. I think his greatest achievement was the recognition that his grandson possessed a gift that the ordinary world would have diminished or dismissed. He recognized it, he valued it, and he created the circumstance by which that gift might be developed and cultivated. And in doing so," Holmes replied, "he demonstrated something that I have come to understand only recently, that the greatest acts of human wisdom are often the most subtle ones. The grand gestures, the dramatic confrontations, the public declarations of understanding. These things are memorable, but they are not necessarily the most effective means of accomplishing genuine change. Sometimes the most profound changes are accomplished through patience, through careful construction, through the patient offering of opportunities that might be declined or accepted, as the other person chooses." They remained at the window for a long moment, and then Holmes turned back toward the sitting room, where the fire was burning low, where the chess pieces on the mantelpiece stood in their eternal arrangement, where the ordinary objects of daily life seemed to have assumed, in the aftermath of recent events, a quality of greater significance and meaning. "Come," Holmes said to Watson, "let us retire. The evening has been long, and there is a certain pleasure in the contemplation of mysteries that have been resolved in ways that transcend the ordinary categories of crime and punishment, of victory and defeat." They ascended the stairs to their respective chambers, and the sitting room of 221B Baker Street was left in quietness, with only the fire crackling softly, and the chess pieces standing watch on the mantelpiece like sentries guarding something precious and irreplaceable. The following December brought with it a transformation that was both subtle and absolute. Charles, now 15 years old, had grown considerably taller, had filled out into a young man whose bearing suggested not arrogance but a genuine confidence born from the knowledge that his particular gifts were recognized and valued. The Saturday sessions at 221B Baker Street had become so established in the rhythms of London life that they seemed to have always existed, as though they were not a recent development but rather a permanent fixture of the social landscape. It was on a Saturday evening in December, exactly 1 year after the arrival of the first chess piece, that Harrow made an announcement that surprised no one, and yet which seemed to crystallize something that had been implicit in all of the developments of the previous year. "I have been thinking," the Admiral said, as the four of them, Holmes, Watson, Harrow and Charles, sat together in the sitting room following a particularly beautiful game of chess, that the time has come to make certain arrangements regarding the boy's future. He paused, and in that pause there was contained all of the emotional weight of the previous year, all of the careful construction, the patient waiting, the gradual unfolding of understanding. "I have no wish to be presumptuous," Harrow continued, "but I have come to understand that the boy would benefit considerably from the opportunity to study under the informal tutelage of someone whose mind is considerably more advanced than my own. I have therefore taken the liberty of making certain inquiries regarding the possibility of some kind of formal arrangement, whereby Charles might spend part of his time here at Baker Street, engaging in more intensive study of the methods of observation and logical reasoning that Mr. Holmes has been teaching him. Holmes, who had clearly anticipated this suggestion, and had in fact been prepared to make precisely such an offer himself, simply nodded. "I have already given considerable thought to such an arrangement," Holmes replied. "I would be delighted to provide whatever instruction the boy requires. The Saturday sessions would continue as they are, but we might also establish additional sessions on, say, Wednesday afternoons, during which we might undertake more intensive study of particular methodologies." Charles's face held an expression of such profound joy that it seemed to Watson that the boy had, in that moment, comprehended the full extent of the gift that was being offered to him. Not merely instruction in the techniques of observation and logical reasoning, but the acknowledgement that his gifts were of sufficient significance to merit the investment of Holmes's time and attention, something that Holmes extended only to matters of the most profound importance. It was Watson who, observing this scene, recognized its true significance. For what was unfolding before him was not merely the establishment of an apprenticeship, though it was certainly that. What was unfolding was the beginning of a new chapter in the life of 221B Baker Street, a chapter in which the sitting room would become, in addition to its function, as the chamber in which Holmes conducted his investigations, also a place of instruction and growth, a space in which a young mind of genuine distinction might be cultivated and developed. The evening concluded as such evenings often did, with the departure of Harrow and Charles, with the settling of the fire as it burned down toward its embers, with the quiet restoration of the ordinary order of things. But Mrs. Hudson, observing Holmes as he stood at the mantelpiece regarding the 6 chess pieces, seemed to recognize something in his expression that suggested a genuine contentment. The kind of contentment that comes not from the resolution of a mystery, but from the knowledge that something of genuine value had been created, had been preserved, and would continue to flourish indefinitely. As Watson settled himself in his chair by the dying fire, he found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey of the past year. The mystery of the chess pieces had been resolved, yes, but in a manner that transcended the ordinary resolution of mysteries. It had been resolved not through the identification of a criminal or the exposure of a deception, but through the establishment of genuine human connection, through the recognition that even minds as exceptional as Holmes's could be reached through patience and understanding, and the careful construction of communication that operated on the level at which such minds naturally functioned. The game, Holmes had said, continues, and indeed it did. It continued through the sessions that would unfold over the years to come, through the gradual development of Charles's capabilities, through the ongoing dialogue between Holmes and Harrow that had been initiated by the arrival of an ivory bishop on a windowsill nearly a year ago. The game continued, not as a competition to be won or lost, but as a conversation between minds that had learned to recognize in one another something of genuine value and genuine significance. And as Watson drifted towards sleep, warmed by the fire and the knowledge that in the room with the 6 chess pieces and the history of careful human connection, something remarkable had been established and would continue to flourish, he found himself thinking that perhaps this was the true measure of wisdom, not the solution of mysteries through logical deduction, but the creation of circumstances by which human beings might recognize in one another the gifts that they possessed, and might commit themselves to the patient cultivation of those gifts for their mutual enrichment, and for the enrichment of all those who might come into contact with their growing understanding. And so, dear friend, we reach the conclusion of this long winter's tale, in the gathering darkness of the December evening, in the warmth of the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, in the presence of minds that have learned to communicate through the patient exercise of understanding, we find not the resolution of a crime, but the beginning of something far more significant, a friendship, a mentorship, a connection between human beings that transcends the ordinary boundaries of time and circumstance. The chess pieces remain on the mantelpiece, monuments to a year of patience and careful construction. The boy, now a young man possessed of genuine confidence and genuine recognition of his own capabilities, continues his Saturday visits, and additional sessions have been established to deepen his understanding further. And the game, as Holmes said, continues, not as a competition to be won or lost, but as a conversation conducted in the quiet spaces between words, in the movements of pieces across a board, in the gradual establishment of understanding between minds that have learned to recognize in one another something of genuine value. Rest now, knowing that in this world of ours, even in the midst of confusion and misunderstanding, there exist people capable of bridging the greatest distances, of healing the deepest wounds, of creating from the raw materials of patience and strategic thinking something that speaks to the best of what human beings are capable of becoming. The fire burns low. The city settles into its winter quiet. And in the peaceful darkness, as you drift towards sleep, know that the game continues, not in the competitive sense, but in the truest sense of human connection and mutual understanding. Sleep well, dear friend. Sleep deeply and peacefully, carrying with you the knowledge that understanding, once achieved, can transform not merely the circumstances of individual lives, but the very landscape of human possibility itself.